and that's ABBA. So instead of giving you ABBA's Gold, which is their greatest hits album, I'm going to talk about Dialectical Behavior Therapy, or DBT, and I'm going to kind of give you the greatest hits of it to give you a little bit of a sense of it. And I'll be looking at some notes on my phone because that's the setup that I've got. But to start out with, if I can advance the slide, a little bit about me, several interesting things. So I was born in Duluth, Minnesota, but I went to college in North Dakota State as a Bison at NDSU. So I did my bachelor's and then my master's in science. Then I went to the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign for my PhD in clinical psychology. As part of that, you have to do a 1-year clinical internship. So I did that at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I was there for 1 year. And then after that, I went down to Atlanta, Georgia at Georgia State University and did a postdoc, which is kind of, after you get your PhD, it's not enough. You still need to learn more. So I did that for 2 years. And now I'm here at U of L as an assistant professor in psychology. And so in total, after high school, I was in college in various forms for about another 10 years or something like that. So if you're interested in this route, you've got lots of school in your future, but you don't necessarily have to do this. And I'm happy to ask questions. I can ask questions about anything. Happy to answer questions you have about this as well. And I will say also, I don't know what the culture of a meeting like this is, but please stop me if you have questions or if I'm not making sense. I do tend to talk to more academic audiences sometimes, and I might be talking and saying a lot of words that you aren't familiar with, and I'm happy to stop and explain things in more detail. So that's my background. I'm going to talk a little bit about this therapy. It's called Dialectical Behavior Therapy. It's a multimodal intervention. So it's got 4 different components. It's got individual therapy, which I'm sure you're kind of familiar with, where as a client, you're working with a therapist, one-on-one, meeting weekly, doing stuff. There's also a skills group component where you learn, the client or whoever's in the thing learns different skills for dealing with life stressors. And then the individual therapy part of that is trying to work to figure out how to use those skills in your day-to-day life when stuff comes up. So the skills group is almost like a class, and the individual therapy is almost kind of like, not quite coaching, but kind of figuring out how to use this stuff. If you do the full model, there's also a phone coaching piece of this where if you're in a crisis, you can call your therapist and go, okay, I'm in this crisis. How should I solve this situation? And they might go, hey, have you tried this skill or that skill? And you'll go, oh, no, maybe I haven't done that. And they'll say, okay, try that out and then get back to me and let me know how that went. So it's kind of ideas to generalize the stuff you're learning in therapy to real life situations so that you can help navigate those. And then there's also a therapist consultation team, which is kind of like support and supervision for the therapist to kind of ongoingly kind of make sure you're getting at the ethos or the core parts of this intervention. So it's kind of a big overview, and the main goal of this is just to help people build a life that's worth living. It was originally designed for or developed for working with people with chronic suicidality, so people that had multiple hospitalizations for suicidal ideation and things like that. And so the goal of this is, people who feel like that sometimes don't have a life that's worth living. And so the goal of this intervention is to build that life for yourself. So there's a couple of different parts of the theory that I try not to get too much into theory, but I think it's kind of interesting to hear a little bit about this. One aspect or one piece of the theory that this therapy is built on is what's called the biosocial theory of borderline personality disorder, which is a lot of psychological sounding gobbledygook. I'll kind of break it down. First, let's replace borderline personality disorder in your mind with emotion dysregulation or difficulty regulating emotions. That's what we're kind of trying to get at. That's the core thing. And what they're talking about is, the idea is everyone's born with different levels of emotionality. Some people are really emotional, some people are medium emotional, some people are not that emotional. And it's, maybe it's genetics, maybe it's somewhat environment, but it's fairly stable and fairly like inborn. And then obviously, like, you grow up in an environment that could be a good fit for that or could not be a good fit for that. And if you're a really emotional person and you're in an environment where everyone's telling you your emotions are too big, stop having these emotions, why are you doing this, like a really invalidating environment, that can kind of actually lead to more trouble regulating emotions, because you're trying to like stuff these emotions down. You have big feelings and you can't do it. And so that's when people turn to different kinds of problem behaviors that maybe work for a little bit of time, but in the long run don't really help. That's kind of the theory here, is that there's this bad fit between sort of the individual person's emotionality and the environment that they're growing up in. That's what biosocial means there. So that's a key part of it, is like there's kind of an individual level and environment, working together or against each other to kind of lead to things. There's two other pieces of theory that are useful to touch on. One of them is behavior theory. So this is all about, if you've heard about Pavlov's dogs salivating to, I don't know, bet red light or a bell, or I forget what the original study is, or if you've ever heard about like, rewards and punishments and stuff like that. So what this is drawing from is the idea that like people do behaviors because they have some kind of reinforcing value, they have some kind of benefit to them, even if it's a short-term benefit, and in the long term it's not very good. So maybe you yell at your partner when you're angry at them, and then they actually do what you like wanted them to do. You're yelling at them has been reinforced, and in the long run maybe you feel bad about it, or the relationship has some problems, but like there is this way that it kind of works in the short term. And so part of the therapy is going to be like, how do we kind of learn other ways of dealing with things and unlearn the things that aren't working for you? And then the third piece is dialectics. So I'm, most of the classes that you take in like high school and college, and definitely the classes you take before that are more of a didactic setting, where there's like a teacher imparting knowledge to the people, to the students, And dialectics is a different way of learning, which is more about multiple people having sort of more equal perspectives. It's more of like a dialogue, and you're trying to synthesize seemingly opposite points of view. So trying to kind of find a way to understand this tension between, if there's matter and there's antimatter, like what's really going on, or like I'm right and you're also right. How do we understand this? Like trying to get into the more of that space. And so it kind of gets away from sort of blame, because sort of like we're both right and we're both wrong, and is more focused sort of like on how we're influencing each other, how we're influencing other people, people are influencing us, the environment's influencing us, to kind of understand more of what's happening. So that's kind of some of the background. So the idea is like people have some emotionality they're born with, they live in different environments that may support or not support that. They might learn behaviors to deal with those emotions that kind of work but not really well, and then they might get into this cycle of like blaming themselves or feeling like they are out of control, and that's where the dialectics comes in. So hopefully that's sort of clear. So I think I kind of touched on this before, but the relation between the skills group and individual therapy is really about kind of different aspects of learning. The skills group is more of like an acquisition. Like I said, it's like a class where you're kind of learning kind of conceptually, like what is this skill for dealing with emotions or dealing with stress, or like asking people for things when you need them. And then individual therapy is more about strengthening and generalizing. So like, how do you like get good at this and then do it in the real world? And so if you kind of use like a strength training metaphor, the skills group would be like when you watch YouTube videos about how to do some weightlifting thing, and then individual therapies, you go to like your trainer and they're like making sure you have good form and like, helping you like increase your weights over time so you can do it, lift heavier weights or something. And there's lots of research support for this. Again, meta-analytic support probably sounds like maybe gobbledygook to you, but there's lots of research supporting this as an intervention for not just like suicidality, but really this dysregulated emotion or trouble regulating emotion. Um, People seem to do much better with an intervention like this. The skills group kind of has two, I talked about dialectics being polar opposites, both being true. So the skills group in DBT has this tension inherent in it between acceptance and change. And so on the one hand, you have to accept that you're like maybe in a more emotional person, you grew up in environments that weren't validating and supportive to you, and sort of now you are who you are because of that. And like you still want to change and do something different in the future, and like both of those things can be true. And so that's a tension that stands out within this intervention. And within the skills, there's some that kind of are more acceptance based, like mindfulness and distress tolerance, which I'll give brief examples of in a second. And there's some that are more change based, like emotion regulation and what they call interpersonal effectiveness, which is more about like social interactions and stuff like that. And so you're kind of learning different skills to navigate how to balance this tension between accepting things as they are and then working towards change. So mindfulness, you probably heard about mindfulness. It's everywhere these days. Within DBT, the goal of mindfulness is to reduce suffering and increase happiness by increasing control of your mind and experiencing reality as it is. So the idea is part of where like suffering happens and part of where like less happiness happens is because we're thinking about the future or we're thinking about the past, and we're not just focused on what's happening in any one moment. And, when you are with your friends hanging out and it's a fun time, but you're worrying about, like a test you have or like work or something, like you're kind of ruining that good time in some ways. And so mindfulness is all about trying to stay in that moment, and not just pleasant moments either, because sometimes when you're in a bad situation and you're thinking about how it's bad now and it's always going to be bad and it's going to get worse, that makes the situation worse as well. And so trying to sort of just stay in whatever moment you're in rather than getting too far into the future or into the past. And one piece of mindfulness, one specific skill that I think is, I kind of give you a little preview and talk a little more about, is non-judgmentalness. This is like one key aspect of mindfulness. And what non-judgmentalness means here is like letting go of evaluating and judging reality. So there's kind of a difference between discriminatory judgments and evaluative judgments. Discriminatory judgments are when there is some agreed upon or clear standard. Like if you spell a word incorrectly, people will be like, I don't know what that word is. If it's 90 degrees, we know that that's different from 30 degrees. So there's a way that there's some kind of agreed upon standard, and those kinds of judgments are useful. You need to know if it's 90 degrees or 30 degrees, because that will influence what clothing you're going to wear. If you go outside and you think it's 90 and it's 30, you're going to be quite cold. Evaluative judgments are basically, the way to think about it is like they're judgments where there is no agreed upon standard. So like, like the big one is like things that you should do. I should be working harder. I should save more money. I should be a better friend, a better, worker, or whatever. Well, there's 99 different ways to define who's a good worker. And there's probably not a clear, there could be ways you could get to a behavioral discriminatory judgment, but it's sort of everyone's going to debate it. And so it's not as helpful or effective to focus on these more evaluative judgments where there's not really any standard or criterion that you're going for. It's just sort of like this gut feeling that you have. So it's kind of letting go of like these shoulds, things that I should do, and more replacing it with like personal feelings and preferences, because your personal feelings and internal states are what they are. And when you don't apply them sort of broadly, like when you make a judgment like everyone should do this, you're deciding that. But if you think I like when people do this, that's a little bit different. And that's sort of one level of letting go of judgments. I can't see my other bullet point. Oops. how can I make this smaller? There we go. Yeah, so the other piece is just, sticking with like behaviors and observables. So instead of like, an evaluation is like, somebody missed the last 2 days of work and you like call them lazy. Well, I mean, that could be lazy. Maybe people would disagree with that. So you replace that with like, you've missed, 2 of your last 3 shifts. That's more of a discriminatory judgment, like you either showed up or you didn't. So kind of moving away from these evaluations and more moving into describing things more, specifically. And this doesn't mean that you're approving of it, doesn't mean that you like it, it doesn't mean that you're like letting people off the hook. You're just turning it into more focusing on kind of like I languages, your own feelings and stuff like that. So this is one piece of mindfulness, is kind of this non-judgmentalness, which can be applied outward and inward, right? You sometimes judge yourself for things that have happened, and letting go of those evaluations and more describing the behavior could be part of that too. Like I'm a bad student because I didn't do well on a test. Well, I didn't do well on the test. Like that's a discriminatory judgment. I'm a bad student. That's an evaluation. So this is one piece of kind of the acceptance, is this mindfulness. Distress tolerance is another piece of the acceptance set of skills. Here, the goals are to survive immediate crises without making them worse. So kind of like getting through these difficult situations the best you can, and accepting reality and trying to become free by accepting reality. And really the idea here is like putting together getting through difficult situations and accepting the times when you like maybe can't change things in that moment. That gets you away from all of these, behaviors that you may engage in that make situations worse, and then that allows for you to be more free because you're actually choosing like what it is that you want to do and not just responding kind of like automatically. And so a really interesting skill in here is radical acceptance, which is kind of taking this idea of acceptance like one step further. And the main point of this skill really is to reduce suffering and increase a sense of freedom by coming to terms with the facts of one's life. And so what this means, like, I think of this kind of in like lawyer terms of it's sort of like conceding the facts. Like sometimes in cases, there's disputed facts where like someone says they were at work at this time and then the other person says they weren't. And then there's facts that everybody agrees upon. And radical acceptance is about kind of figuring out those facts that of life that should be agreed upon. And the idea is when you stop fighting reality, you stop wishing things were different and accept them as they are. That actually lets you now move to more change because you kind of know what's happening, you know the lay of the land, you know why things are the way they are, and that is necessary for doing an intervention and figuring out what's going to be different. And so there's some pieces to this. There's things that we need to accept. The first one is reality is what it is. Sometimes we'd like it to be different things, but it is what it is. Like when you're stuck in traffic, you're stuck in traffic, no matter how much you wish you weren't stuck in traffic. That's just what happens. And we have to accept that reality is what it is, with this very interesting caveat that we don't necessarily have to accept our thoughts about what we think reality is. So maybe there's a way that we're like distorting things, like judgments creep in, and those we have to accept that we have those thoughts, but we don't have to accept the content of those thoughts. So like if you think, oh, I'm a bad student, I got a C on this test, you don't have to accept that it's true that you're a bad student. You do have to accept that you've had that thought, though. So there's kind of a subtle distinction there. Another piece is that everyone's future has limitations, right? Like we have like sort of several options. It's not limitless. Like unless there's huge changes in modern medicine, like since I was, born with a certain set of chromosomes, I'm probably never going to get pregnant and have a baby. I do have a baby, but like I did not give birth to it, and so that's just a limitation. And now that I'm however old I am, I'm probably not going to become an Olympic swimmer because I probably would have had to start doing that already. So there are limitations to life. It doesn't mean that it's determinative, but you have to sort of sometimes have certain training to be able to do certain things. So there's kind of a sequence to life sometimes. The third thing is that from this perspective, everything in the universe has a cause. So this is kind of in contrast to everything is chaos. This is seeing things as outcomes of some causal chain. Even bad things that happen, like there are causes and things make sense. Is that a question? No, okay. So sometimes I use like the example of like the Challenger explosion, which was like a rocket that took off in the 80s, and basically there was a problem with the seal between the rocket booster between, I'm trying to remember now if it's the oxygen and hydrogen or whatever two chemicals you come together to like boost a rocket off the Earth. The seal between those two things wasn't perfect, and as the ship took off, those two gases got together and caused a big explosion. And so that's what happens when those two gases come together, they explode, and if the seal isn't perfect, that's what happens. So there are causes to it. It doesn't mean that we have to like the outcome of it, but once we know that there are causes and can figure them out, then we can try to change some of those things. And the last piece here is like life can be living even if it contains pain. The simple thing is like if life had to be pain-free for it to be worth living, nobody would have a life worth living. Everybody's life has pain. And really it's that non-acceptance of pain and wishing things were different that makes that even worse, right? Like when you're stuck in traffic, wishing you were not in traffic, it makes the traffic so much worse. I don't know why traffic keeps being my example, but any of these situations you can think of where something bad has happened and then wishing it was worse just kind of like adds to that, rather than kind of an acceptance, that non-judgmentalness of just like, this is happening now. I don't have to like it, but it is what's happened. So that's kind of a flavor for what some of these acceptance-based skills look like. Now I'll give two quick examples of the change-based skills, and then I should have some time for questions and stuff. So the goal of the emotion regulation section is to understand emotions, decrease the frequency of unwanted emotions, and decrease vulnerability to emotions. So working, here very clearly working to change things, decrease the frequency, decrease emotional vulnerability. And one skill that's in this area is called opposite action. And the idea behind this is when emotions don't lead to effective behavior, which I'll break down in a second, acting opposite to these emotions will likely change the emotions if it's done repeatedly and all the way. So what does effective mean? Effective means getting to your goals. This is the way we get around, I mentioned all the stuff about evaluation, and so you don't want to be like, oh, this was good or bad. DBT uses the language of it was effective or not, because effective is more of a discrimination, like it helped you get your goal or it didn't, versus it was good or bad. So when you have an emotion that isn't going to lead to an effective behavior, or an emotion basically that doesn't fit a situation, acting opposite to that can change the emotion. So take it, for example, you're home at night, all the doors are locked, everything's locked and everything's safe, but you hear a creaky sound, the house is settling or something like that. You feel really afraid, right? Because you just watched some horror movie and you're a little keyed up. So you have this fear to like hide under the bed or something like that. That's what the emotion is telling you to do. But in this situation, I'm actually like safe. Like I know no one else is here, everything's locked. So acting opposite of that fear to hide under the bed is the way to change the emotion. And if you go hide under the bed, the next time you're in that situation, you hear the creak, the emotion's going to be just as strong, if not stronger. So that's kind of the idea behind this. So the steps to this, the first thing is trying to identify the emotion you want to change. So, this is helpful because it helps kind of key into what the opposite actions are. So is this shame, or is this sadness, or is this anger, or is this, what is this emotion? A second piece is kind of checking the facts. So this gets into that idea of just talking about of radical acceptance. So like, what is actually happening in this situation, and what's my interpretation of the situation? Let's kind of clear that up. Then you want to identify the action urges that you have. So what's this emotion telling you to do? My anger is telling me to yell at this person. My fear is telling me to cancel my plans. My sadness is telling me to like hide under the covers. You want to identify what those action urges are, and then think about, will acting on these urges make the situation better or worse? So if I feel sad and I hide under the covers all day, is that going to make me feel less sad? No, probably not. I'm probably going to feel the same, if not worse. If I'm angry at this person, is yelling at them going to change the situation for the better or the worse? Sometimes maybe it will make it better, but a lot of times it will often make it worse. So you want to think about that. And if acting on the situation isn't going to make it any better, do the opposite. So I'm angry at this person, I want to yell at them. That's not going to make it better. Give them a compliment. Say something nice. If I want to stay in bed all day because I'm sad, watch a comedy, do something, go out, do something the opposite of that. And then do that all the way, meaning like if you're anxious about going to a party and you go to a party and stand in the corner and don't talk to anybody, it's not going to work. So you got to go and you got to be, introduce yourself to everybody and really kind of throw yourself into it for it to work, and then repeat, as needed. Question?
Yes, it's me, Konrad. I had a quick question. Yeah. So I would imagine some youth might be asking, like, how do you even start to engage in emotional regulation or to embody these steps? Is it usually better to do it with a guided therapist or do it by themselves? Like, I can only imagine I'm angry. The last thing I want to do is identify that emotion, right? I want to feel it. So how do you kind of ease into these steps? Like what do you see beneficial?
That's a good question. Yeah. I mean, and it can vary. I mean, I think if you've got an individual therapist, that's a great place to work through some of this stuff, especially if there are repeated things, like you have a certain emotion that is one that, like this one comes up a lot and is causing problems for me. Like that's something to maybe focus on. But then there may be, this is also, useful for all people in all different areas of life. And so if you have success implementing it on your own, that works too, right? And that's sort of the trick of these kinds of things is, how much support do you need and how much support do you need over time? There may be a point where, for whatever reason, stressors are high. I need more support now. And then, 3 months later, stressors are lower and you're able to do a lot of this without the extra support. And then something else happens later on, you need to go back. So there is kind of like a cyclical way with that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and it kind of makes me think maybe it might help some youth for those of us that aren't in the emotion of anger, that might remember ourselves in that, to go through that and like maybe think about how we would react, right? So that way in the moment we can embody these steps.
Right, yeah. And I do also, I'm sort of presenting it as this, like, the goal is not always to do the opposite action. There may be times where anger is really justified, right? Like, there may be times where that is emotion that you should feel, and it does make sense to feel, and it's effective to feel. So I do also want to point that out, but then there are other times where, yelling at my boss really isn't going to make anything better. It's going to make things worse. So maybe that's a time for like an opposite action. So we're doing okay on time. Let me hit on one quick other skill, and then I'll have time for like some more questions and maybe chatting. So the final module is about interpersonal effectiveness, which I said is sort of like social situations. So trying to be skillful in getting what you want from other people or what you need from others, building relationships, and what they call walking the middle path. So this chunk is all about like, how do you make a request? How do you say no to things? How do you build friendships? How do you maintain your self-respect? How do you navigate all this stuff? And one of the key parts of this is dialectics, which I kind of touched on a little bit in the theory piece, but it's really useful in interpersonal situations. So a dialectical stance is essential for what they call walking the middle path, because it kind of decreases a sense of isolation, conflict, and polarities. And the idea behind the middle path is like, so many times in interpersonal situations, we get into conflict. We have different views, different opinions. We want to do different things. And that's where it seems like there's these opposing opposite forces, but we have to like try to find some kind of middle path or some kind of way to like work together on things. And that's what dialectics can help us do. So there's four key things that dialectics teaches us. One of them is that the universe is filled with opposing forces, and both of those things can be true. Like I said before, there's matter and there's antimatter. That's a very physics one. Um, but there's also like you can think about just even like there's a room that you're in, and then there's like outside of that room. Those are kind of opposing things. There's a room and outside the room. Everything kind of often has like an opposite to it, and we need to know sort of what those both pieces are because it helps us understand something. I need to know what the room I'm in is because I need to know how to get to the next room because I need to know where those boundaries of those things are. Another thing is that like everything is connected in some way. So even we're connected digitally with ones and zeros are allowing us to connect to this in this meeting. But we are also connected physically because we're all in buildings that are touching the ground of the earth that is connected, and we're all, I think we're all, Kentucky or Louisville metro area. So we're kind of all breathing the same air. I mean, maybe it's not the exact same air, but that air is all connected and blowing around. So there's all these ways that we're connected, and that can help decrease that sense of isolation. I think sometimes when you get into conflict, it feels like you against the world, but you are still connected. The next piece is about how change is the only constant. So this gets back to the theme of like acceptance. Change is the thing that's always happening. Like change is always going to happen, and we have to accept that, and that helps us be more flexible when things change. And this also means that like meaning and truth can evolve over time. So like what is true for you at one point can change. What's important to you in life can change. And that's okay. That's normal. That's how things work. And the last piece may not surprise you, is based on other things I've talked about, is change is transactional. This means that I influence you, you influence me, we both influence each other. And so blame doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense because it's this cycle that starts somewhere and keeps going. And so when you look at this in interpersonal situations, it's more about like what am I doing that's like influencing you, and what are you doing that's influencing me, and how can we maybe rework that to come to some conclusion in this situation. So I'm going to skip the encore for time, and then maybe stop sharing my screen and answer other questions that people have about this. I know this is a bit of a whirlwind, but hopefully it was somewhat interesting.
Feel free to ask any questions or put them in the chat. Maybe I can start, Konrad. I think a lot of them heard CBT. They kind of know what cognitive behavioral therapy is. And if you can kind of summarize the difference between DBT, CBT, so they can kind of like really sparse out the difference between them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like where this therapy came from initially, Marsha Linehan's the one who created it. And initially she tried to do more like cognitive behavior therapy with chronically suicidal people. And so, asking questions of like, but is your life like really that bad and stuff? And, obviously like people hated that. It didn't work. And it was missing kind of this validation acceptance piece. And so DBT incorporates a lot of cognitive and behavior therapy stuff, but it also brings in what they call like fourth wave stuff. So more like acceptance, intersecting with kind of mindfulness and Eastern philosophies and things like that. So adding kind of some of those pieces to some of the other tools. Does that make sense? I feel like I started to trail off the end.
No, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any questions? Don't be shy. Anything about maybe how Konrad got to where he is?
Yeah, you could ask even more. You don't need to be like on slide 7 when you said this. You could even just be like, how did you get a PhD? I could talk about that.
Not really a question, but I thought the talk about radical acceptance was really cool. I've only talked about it like maybe once in therapy. I'm not going to therapy currently, but when I was going to therapy, I know that's something we talked about. She compared it to almost like a train, my thoughts being a train, like going on the tracks and you have to stop and like even though like it's frustrating, like you have to just come to acceptance that the train, the thought is there and you have to wait for it to pass and it's not going to last forever. Every train comes to an end and then you can move forward, but you have to kind of just come to acceptance that the train is going to be there, like when the train comes. So I thought that was interesting to hear, like in perspective of like the whole lecture.
Yeah, there's lots of good metaphors for explaining these things. I like that one.
Don't be shy. I know you all have questions lingering in your minds. Feel free to ask anything.
So for your career, what exactly do you do on a day-to-day basis? Are you just teaching or do you get to do other stuff or what's up?
Yeah, so technically, let's see, how does my split work? I mean, the majority of my time technically is supposed to be teaching. I teach two courses a semester, and I teach both graduate and undergraduate courses. A chunk of my time is doing research, and then some of my time is like service, like on different university committees and stuff like that. But some of my teaching is also clinical supervision. So like I supervise the PhD students learning how to do therapy. So I do still have kind of like a somewhat of a connection to therapy, but I haven't done any in I guess since I've been here. I am licensed though. So yeah, it's a mix between like teaching, doing research. I work with a lot of graduate students like Julia, who got this connected here, and other folks. So yeah, it's a mix of different things every day, honestly, which I kind of like, and also can be kind of overwhelming.
Anyone else
Something in the
having
chat. Oh, just you. Okay.
questions? Yeah, sorry. It's me.
Konrad, I have a question. What do you suggest to do when you speak about overwhelm? So when you get overwhelmed or when someone else gets overwhelmed, what is some advice that you could give us to kind of manage that? Because it's overwhelming.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I think that my immediate reaction is to kind of go towards like mindfulness and trying to let go, because often when we're overwhelmed, we're thinking about the past, the future, the present all at once. Like I have to do this thing and that thing and this thing and that thing, and I never got this thing done, and like and so I think trying to like, what is the actual thing in front of me? Like, where am I right now? Like, what is the thing that I have to do here? The stuff in the future I'll get to, the stuff in the past, either it's done or I'll go back to it when I need to. But just like, what's the one thing here? And can I get through this one moment? And then when you get through that moment, can I get through this next moment? So sort of breaking it down into these little more manageable chunks. Because often part of overwhelmingness is like thinking about everything all at once, and that is overwhelming. and we can't do all that at once. So trying to kind of get more to what's happening right now. What do I even need to do anything right now? Because a lot of times overwhelming is also stuff that can't be solved in this moment. And like I texted someone and they haven't texted me back, and I don't know what to do. What does this mean? Like I see the three dots for the last hour, and it's like, okay, they're going to respond when they respond. Like I can't actually do anything. And so, maybe a little bit of acceptance and just distraction or something. I saw some things in chat. Colleges for this kind of work. I mean, like I said, if you really want to get into sort of doing therapy, it's a bit of a long game because you've got to do undergrad and some level of graduate stuff. And so I think, finding universities that have strong psychology programs and particularly strong clinical psychology programs will give you, access to the types of experiences that will help you get into graduate school. And then kind of move on to the next step. The other thing I would mention is, the kinds of, experiences you can have like as an undergraduate student. There are, if you're interested in kind of more like helping professions, there are often bachelor's level or pre-bachelor's level jobs at like group homes or other places like that where they're kind of helping profession adjacent, that you can have some of those experiences. Like I did that when I was like undergrad. I worked at like a group home for kids and was very like behavior therapy kind of approach, but it was a good learning experience. And I got paid to do it, and so that's a bonus, right? And that was even decent pay too. So that's another thing to think about. Research becomes like a big part of it if you want to go to get a PhD, because a PhD is a research degree. But there's lots of master's level degrees that you can ultimately get licensed and do therapy with that don't require research too. So another thing is just kind of looking into options and kind of thinking about what it is that you might want to do. And then in college, like trying some of that stuff out, like, I'll try to do some research in the lab and see what that's like. And okay, not for me. I'm not interested in getting a PhD, or like, I kind of think it's interesting. Maybe I'll do some more, So just kind of having opportunities, trying to build a portfolio that makes you a good candidate, as you move up the ladder. So that's a bit of a long game.
I think we have time for one more question. Any question? Konrad will answer.
The other thing I'll say too quickly is like, if you have more questions about college, graduate school stuff, I guess, I don't know if they have my email or not, but you could share my email and feel free to reach out whenever. It's like 3 years from now, I'll still probably respond and give you feedback or advice or whatever.
Perfect.
If no one
Any
asks,
last-
I was gonna say, if no one else is gonna ask stuff, like I don't want to take up
Yes.
all your questions. I feel like I've already talked, but
Go ahead, Kayla.
I find myself doing a lot of activities. I talked to Nada about that. I do a ton of things. I'm involved in like everything. How would you recommend staying in the moment, like, and not getting caught up in like everything?
That's a good question. I guess you would want to add another activity of practicing staying in the moment to your list of things, or there's a part of mindfulness in DBT that's called participate, and the idea behind it is when you're doing a task, do the task, and like let go of like thinking about the next task you have to do. And like if you think of like improv or something like that, where you can't think of the next thing, you have to participate. So if you've got a lot of activities, that gives you lots of time to practice doing that and just like be fully in that activity that you're doing. And then when it's over, moving on to the next one and just being in that, and that may be also a way to do that. And then then you kind of let go of like self-consciousness and things, right? Because if you're just doing the activity, you can't think, am I doing this right? Like, because you're just doing it,
Well, Konrad, thank you so much. I think we're hitting the top of the hour. Thank you. I don't think Julia has shared your email with us,
Okay.
but I can.
I think
can
I
find
think
it.
I have yours, so I can pass it
Perfect.
along. I can reply.
Yes, please do, and I'll pass it to the Youth Liberty Council, and for those that couldn't join us, and I'll make sure to upload this to our YouTube account. So thank you again, Konrad. This was wonderful. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
well, have us back whenever. Like we have lots of people in my lab who can talk about lots of things. So
Perfect. We will do that. Absolutely. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Bye everyone.